Welcome to episode 469. On today's show, a prayer service in Portland turns into a clash between Proud Boys and Antifa armed with paintball guns. Phil's Facebook page erupted after our recent episode about reparations, leading us to ask whether evangelical theology is simply incapable of grasping the biblical idea of corporate sin. That leads us into a wider discussion on individualism and collectivism, and the way America, the most individualist society on earth, thinks about liberty, economics, and even theology. And what effect does all this have on the American church? Then, I talked to Kara Powell, director of the Fuller Youth Institute, about their latest research on teenagers and faith. But we kick off today's show with some animal news that may explain why the Americans beat the Redcoats in the Revolution and why Britain no longer has an empire. Thanks for joining us. Here's today's show.
Hey there, this is Phil. Welcome back to the Holypost podcast. I'm here with Skye Jitani. Hi, Skye.
Hi, Phil.
Hi. And Caitlin Chess. Hi, Caitlin.
Hi, Phil.
And Caitlin, is this the first time you're joining us from your new part of the world?
Yeah, I'm in Durham, North Carolina now, and I'm not going anywhere for a while.
Okay,
So
that raises a question. Earlier today, in text message, you asked what time we were recording, but you were asking in Pacific time. Why?
Yeah, I don't know why.
Why you're on the East Coast?
I don't know. The request came to me and it said Pacific time, and so I was just making sure that wasn't raw. I don't know.
I don't know what you got to work out.
I know.
Skye, were you traveling when you sent out the invite? Were you in California when you sent out the invite?
No, I was in Okoboji.
You were in Okoboji. Well,
yeah,
that's by water.
Week.
That's by a big body of water. Maybe, Zencaster or Google or whoever doesn't know the Pacific from beautiful West Lake Okoboji. I don't know. So Skye and I were in Okoboji, Iowa last week. We're back. I think I have got enough interesting stuff to talk about. I was kind of off the grid. So things may have happened that I don't know about. I don't know. Was there an Olympics? Did the Olympics happen? Anybody?
Apparently.
I've heard that.
Okay. Well, Caitlin seems pretty excited about the Olympics. Jason, did you anything wild happen while we were away at Okoboji?
I'm trying to think. I think the wildest thing was probably everything that happened with Simone Biles at the Olympics, but that was about it. And then she came back. So, but I can't think of anything else. It was pretty boring. You guys left and took all the news with you.
Yeah, that's for sure. Okay, well, here's the theme song. What's the news that you like the most? Who's your favorite podcast host? If it's breakfast, get your toast. It's Skye and Phil and the Holy Post. Skye and Phil and the Holy Post. And sometimes Caitlin. Okay, this just in. This is a news story that actually just Skye just found it, but it seemed like it was worth addressing directly. So you hear it from us before you hear it from anyone else. Could you beat a goose in a fight? Jason, just off the top of your head, could you, Jason, beat a goose in a fight?
So the college I went to was actually well known for having geese in the middle part of the campus. So I've had fights with geese. I've had to fight off geese before, and yes, I've won.
Okay. I guess I picked the right person to ask.
Was this barehanded, or did you use an instrument?
Backpack. Yeah.
Okay.
I like
to use a trombone when I'm goose fighting. I find that my best instrument. It's just the slide. The slide unsettles them. Like, that horn's getting longer. What's going on? Okay, survey. It started out as a survey in America, but then the British wanted to get in on it, so they did a survey on the other side of the pond to ask, how do you think you would do if fighting these different animals? And it was everything from, here's the list: a rat, house cat, goose, medium-sized dog, eagle, large dog, chimpanzee, king cobra, kangaroo, wolf, crocodile, grizzly bear, elephant, lion, or gorilla. And as you can imagine, there's quite a difference between people's responses between could you beat a rat in a fight and could you beat a gorilla in a fight. what is more interesting is that on virtually every animal, Americans thought they were more likely to beat the animal than the British.
That's because the American's more likely to be packing heat.
It doesn't. I'm assuming that you
No.
can't be armed. I'm assuming because if you have a big enough gun, what animal couldn't you beat?
Exactly. I think that's an assumption you can't just pass over when you're surveying Americans.
Well, okay,
That's
but
true.
here's what I find interesting. 67% of Britons believe they could beat a rat in hand-to-hand combat, which means 33% of Britons think they'd lose.
And that's
a
exactly
rat.
why they don't have an empire anymore.
Okay, 34% of Britons think they would lose to a house cat. 31% of Americans think they would lose to a house cat. I'm not sure what losing to a house cat looks like.
Not fighting because you don't want to.
Is this a battle to the death, or what's?
Yeah.
I don't know. Are you willing to kill a house cat? No. Well, then you lose. No, I don't know. Just could you beat a house cat in a fight? That's the question, and then people just answered. But then the next one down on the list gets crazy because it's a goose. Okay, and the gap between British and American perception of goose fighting abilities is huge. 61% of Americans believe they could defeat a goose in hand-to-hand combat. Only 45% of Britons believe they could defeat a goose. So 55% of the British believe that their country could be taken over by geese and they could do nothing about it. That's a little concerning, isn't it?
This is not Churchill's England anymore, is it?
I don't know. We might also be not focusing enough on the overconfidence of Americans. There are probably some Americans who said, "Yeah, I could beat a goose." That 100% could not beat a goose.
Could not beat a goose. Yeah, we are.
Yeah.
We are often overconfident.
Yeah,
I think that there's a lot of Americans who, it's the hold my beer and watch this syndrome.
Yeah,
Where a little bit of liquid courage gets in the way of good sense.
But here's where it gets weird, though. I mean, I'm a little disturbed that 33% of Britons don't think they could beat a rat in a fist fight.
I couldn't.
What?
Because I wouldn't try. I would run away and not fight the rat.
But if you had to, if the rat was dragging your child out of the house, would you? Of course, you'd take the rat.
Okay, maybe.
Unless it's the rat that trained the Ninja Turtles, you should have no problem defeating a rat. What was that one's name? Shredder?
Yeah, Shredder.
Yeah. Very good. And should Shredder be next in line to meet the Pope, Skye?
That's
why not? Callback from a prior episode. Okay. You remember the Spider-Man story, Caitlin. Don't look at me like that.
I do.
Do
I
not look at me like that, like you don't know what I'm talking about, because you know what I'm talking about. Okay, now this is where it gets really weird in the other direction. 17% of Americans think they could beat a chimpanzee in hand-to-hand combat.
Oh, no.
Idiots. That is so dumb.
No way.
17% of Americans. I think they're thinking of infant chimpanzees that you might see on the Tonight Show, being all cute and drinking from a bottle. But chimpanzee is twice as strong as a grown man and will chew your face off, and you can't do a thing about it.
I want to know the gender breakdown there, because I have a guess that it's mostly men.
I've got it. I've got it. Men fights men are more likely to think they can win regardless of country. Chimpanzee. Yeah. Okay, so chimpanzee. About 3% of British women think they could beat a chimpanzee, which is still way too high.
It is too high.
About 12% of American women think they could beat up a chimpanzee.
Wow.
That's 4 times more.
Who
Does
are
it
these women?
from the TV we watch? Are we watching the wrong shows that give us I'm watching Wonder Woman?
It was that Tiger King thing last
Oh,
summer.
yeah. Okay. But British men are way up around 14% think that they could beat up a chimpanzee.
Wait a minute. But that means British men have about as much self-confidence as American women.
A wee bit more. A wee
Tiny
bit
bit.
more.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then American men, enter John Wayne, Jesus and John Wayne. American men 22% of American men believe they could
Wow.
defeat a chimpanzee in hand-to-hand combat.
Wow.
And
Whoa.
almost 10% of American men believe they could defeat an elephant.
Oh my God. That explains a lot, honestly.
Wrestling holds that they learned in middle school. You got to get if you can put their arm behind their back and you can get them in a half Nelson. I can get that elephant in a half Nelson and he won't be able to do anything. I don't know. They think they're more likely to believe they can defeat an elephant than a lion, but not by much. And 8% almost 10% of American men believe they could beat up a gorilla.
That's delusional. I think the only explanation for this is if they assume they have a weapon.
Maybe.
Yeah.
The other conclusion we can draw is that either British women are the most rational, or Phil, you and I are secretly British women.
Those are the only two conclusions.
That's the only conclusions because they're the only. I would
we're rational.
No, because I don't think we would ever say we could defeat any of those animals, and that puts us in line with British women.
I know for sure I could beat up a rat or a house cat. I'm pretty sure I could beat up a goose.
I'm talking
What
about
a medium-sized dog. That's the next one. Do you think you could beat up a medium-sized dog?
What's medium size? How big is that? 50 pounds?
Steve. Could you beat up Steve if Steve really didn't want you to?
Yeah, totally.
Okay, well, it's on. Call in Steve. Steve, get in here.
Well, I think Alfie's in here. I would have a harder time beating up Alfie. And Alfie's actually smaller than Steve, but he's nasty. He's a terrier. Steve's a lover, not a fighter.
Okay. So what do we learn from this story? I don't know what to say. 2% of British men think they could beat up a grizzly bear. 6% of American men think they could beat up a grizzly bear. What do we learn from that? We're all crazy? Is everyone crazy?
No, 6% of
Men
us.
a little bit more.
Men a little bit more. Yeah, it's not. British women, it's not hard to beat up a rat. Now, you might be afraid of it and you might not want to beat it up. But if the rat was dragging your child out of the house, you would beat up the rat. I'm pretty sure.
Maybe the rats are just bigger.
Maybe. We need
Have you seen
look up
Pizza
London
Rat?
Rats. Yeah. Pizza
Yeah.
Rat.
Or
Fun.
Princess Bride.
Yeah, our rats are plenty big on this side of the pond.
Okay. Something happened in Portland yesterday, actually. Something happened in Portland yesterday that I think shows you where we are as a culture. Do you want to know what happened in Portland? No, nobody does? All right, I'll move on to the next story.
I have a bad feeling about this.
Proud Boys and Antifa clash with paintball guns and pepper spray at a Portland prayer service.
Oh, no.
That doesn't sound right.
Far right and far left activists exchanged paintball fire and pepper spray in Portland on Sunday as the Proud Boys and anti-fascists clashed at a controversial Canadian pastor's rally. A Christian group led by Pastor Artur Pawlowski organized a prayer service at Tom McCall Waterfront Park, where about 50 people attended. Members of the Proud Boys appeared to be working as security. Okay, so you're a pastor from Canada, home of the militant pastors of North America, obviously. So you're going to go to Portland. Why are you going to go to Portland? I don't know why you're going to go to Portland. You're going to go to Portland to hold a rally, but it's a prayer rally. So you need security, obviously, because it's Portland. So you bring in the Proud Boys to be your security so you can pray without being disturbed. And of course, because now the Proud Boys are there, Antifa shows up. And now,
wait a minute.
yes.
Their security is armed with paintball guns?
And batons. Paintball guns and batons. It just sounds like a 13-year-old boy's birthday party gone horribly wrong.
Yes, it does.
Or like a Mad Lib. Just put random words together into a story.
Mad Lib prayer service.
The service was disrupted by members of Antifa clad in black who began throwing smoke grenades. So first of all, the bad 13-year-old kid comes in with smoke bombs that he brought from home and attempting to dismantle the group's PA system. Now, they're going to mess with the lights or pull the fire alarm. So that's the next step. And then, of course, the religious service lasted for about 90 minutes before both sides began to get in each other's faces. Police vehicle responded to the action, but did not intervene. The police didn't get out of their car. They just watched as two groups pepper sprayed each other and shot each other with paintballs in the name of prayer.
Wait, they both had paintballs?
I think so. Yeah.
Wait, to be fair, if I'm in a prayer service, that goes over 90 minutes, it might get violent.
Oh, Skye. Let's talk about how long people prayed in the Bible, Skye. Let's talk about David when his son was going to die. How long did he pray? How long did he pray fast, Skye?
But that's not a prayer service. There's a difference. I'm all about praying without ceasing. It's when you have to do that.
David had an organist playing under his praying?
No, I'm pretty sure he didn't.
I'm with you, Skye. That's a really long time.
Is this the end game for the polarization? Is that little events like, hey, let's have a prayer meeting, now have paintball armed militias on either side protecting the prayer meeting or trying to disrupt the prayer meeting? Is this where it's going?
You know what? If our divisions as a society don't get any more violent than paintball, I will consider that a victory, because I think it could get way, way worse than that.
Okay. All right. I see your point. Caitlin, any thoughts on that?
It is really, it's not only bizarre that they asked of all the people to give you security, Proud Boys, so we're just going in strong with the white supremacy there, but also it's such a picture, like it's the most extreme picture, I can imagine, before going to physical violence, really, of like, we go in with the expectation that people are so against us that we actually bring the violence before anyone else retaliates. Like, it's a picture of when you go into a conversation thinking this is going to be a fight, you'll turn it into a fight. When you go into the world thinking I'm against the world and the world is against me, you are going to, of course, cause more conflict than if you just, what's the worst that could happen to you in Portland? Are people going to protest you? Are they going to, the worst case, are they going to spit at you? Are they going to harass you? Is that really like the worst possible thing that you can imagine, such that you have to start with that level of violence and protection? Like, why wouldn't we be the people to say, like, yeah, come at us. Like, we are not going to come in, be the ones bringing violence in. If something comes to us, we will expect that and we will take it and we will suffer as Jesus suffered, but we will not be the ones coming in bringing the violence.
Well, Pastor Pawlowski is a well-known agitator in Canada, known for his brazen anti-homosexuality stance, and was arrested there in May for confronting law enforcement and calling them Nazis for enforcing COVID-19 restrictions.
Oh, my word.
So he's a bit of a flamethrower. Yeah. And what more fun locale to throw your flames than Portland, which has had unrest for the last 18 months.
You're trying to start something.
I think so. I'm not real excited about that. And hopefully this does not become a thing where Christian evangelists travel the country under Proud Boy escort, waiting to be attacked by Antifa. I wanted to... have any of you been on my Facebook page in the last week?
No. I don't go to Facebook.
Yeah, I know you. Definitely not you. The conversations we've had about reparations and race and justice, and David French's article about institutional responsibility. A defense of, we're not talking about individual guilt based on things that happened in the past. We're talking about institutional responsibility, which has been kind of a theme of what we've been talking about. That kind of blew up on my Facebook page, and we the Gregory Thompson interview, when I posted that has like 1,300 comments now, and kind of turned into some furniture throwing. And then the story from David French now has almost 900 comments, and has kind of turned into furniture throwing. And I continue to be surprised at the level of aggressive pushback you get when you bring up topics of racial justice or racial injustice. And it kind of seems to be solidifying, kind of like the mask debate and the vaccine debate in, now it's us versus them. And I have to oppose you because you're taking their position, not our position. Even if you're doing it in a reasonable way, I'm going to assume what you really mean is all the most extreme things I've ever heard, on pick your favorite news source. But Dr. Anthony Bradley, who's a professor at King's College in New York, African-American professor, he tweeted something interesting a couple of weeks ago that I grabbed. I screen grabbed it because I wanted to bring it up at some point, because we were talking with Gregory Thompson about how we don't really have the tools in Skye's interview with Gregory Thompson, but evangelicals don't really have the tools for addressing things like collective sin. We just in social justice, we don't have the tools for that because we've individualized everything so much. Anthony Bradley quoted Reinhold Niebuhr in a series of tweets a couple of weeks ago, where he said, Reinhold Niebuhr explains that the Dwight Moody / Billy Graham version of Christianity is, quote, too simplistic and perfectionistic and impotent to address collective sin. And Bradley says, this is why 2021 Reformed evangelicals have no way of explaining how or why their heroes from the past also advanced white supremacy. Bradley continues and says, revivalistic Christianity has never been effective, says Reinhold Niebuhr, at challenging collective or social evil. Eastern Orthodox, Catholic, and mainline Protestant traditions have frameworks for this. So don't expect, quote, Great Commission type Christians to see evil beyond individual action. Their view of Christianity thinks that rising out of a tub of water renders people incapable of participating in social evil. I thought that was an interesting quote, in particular, that you've been baptized, so you can't be a part of anything bad that's bigger than yourself.
This came up in my interview with Gregory Thompson, and he basically called BS on that, because he pointed out, and I think accurately, that as the other guy puts it, Great Commission Christians don't have any problem talking about cultural sins when it comes to issues that they care about politically, like abortion, for example.
Right.
So there's a selectivity of which things we are willing to address on a cultural, institutional, or social level, and which things we go, no, that's just a matter of individual sin. So I agree with him partly, and Niebuhr, that there isn't a framework that readily makes the social dynamic or corporate elements easy for Great Commission Christians to understand, but it isn't like it's impossible. They do it when it's necessary.
It's curious, because I wonder how people, if you switch to abortion, I wonder how people make the leap to say, oh no, that's a societal evil that I have to oppose. That's killing babies. And I have to oppose that because it's a whole evil system. Planned Parenthood is a whole evil system that we must bring down.
Right.
You have to notice that you're making a switch there, right? No?
I don't know that we have the same, though, like, personal sense of, like, because I'm part of this country in which abortion is legal and Planned Parenthood exists, I have this, like I might have a personal responsibility because I care about abortion and I want to, like, fight for laws that limit it. But I don't think we have the same sense with abortion that we might maybe need to have with both abortion and with racial justice, of, like, this is a problem in my country because of cultural things that impact me. Like I might not get an abortion, but I might have a sense of the kind of way we can just discard life, or the way that convenience is the most important thing, or the way that, you know, we justify certain evils as long as it fulfills economic goals. Or I don't know that we have the same sense with abortion. We still treat it in some ways very individually. We might think it's a really big problem, but we actually might be benefited by thinking both about racial justice and about abortion in those larger ways that could serve that cause. But like, we don't always take that leap with abortion either, I don't think.
Okay, Caitlin, let me challenge that for a second, and here's why. Last year,
Go for it.
And this is anecdotal, so I could be completely wrong, but last year we created that a video about abortion leading up to the election based on a lot of the stuff that David French wrote and other sources that basically argued simply overturning Roe v. Wade isn't going to have the effects people want, but there are these really practical things we can do which have been proven to lower the actual number of abortions. And that kind of blew up into a huge online debate, and I wrote numerous responses to it. And what I heard from many people was, at the end of the day, they weren't primarily motivated to actually reduce the number of abortions. What they really wanted to do was get abortion off the books as a legal right in America. And I even asked some of them point blank, if you had a choice between eliminating Roe v. Wade or reducing the number of abortions by half, which would you pick? And a lot of people said they want it off the books. It isn't about the actual number of children who are saved. It's about getting the law changed. And I think the only way to explain that is there are some American Christians who feel culpable for abortion because their core identity is that they are an American, and they can't handle the fact that American law allows abortion. So once you make it illegal, then they can go, okay, I'm clean and innocent as an American, even if an individual person still chooses to have an abortion. And I think the same thing goes true with reparations and racism. What people react to is not that there are tons of people historically and currently of color who face systemic injustice in America. They don't want to be called responsible for it. They don't want to have any sense of communal guilt for it. And that's what they react to. So it's a weird way of saying that on both abortion and race issues, just don't blame me, and I'll feel okay about whatever you choose to do after that.
Yeah, I do think for some people it might be I just want the law changed because I want my country to reflect the things that I, you know, in that systemic way. I do wonder though, I talked to a lot of people before the election who wanted the law to change and cared less about the kind of actual number of abortions reduced. And were clear about that, but didn't have a good articulation of why they cared about that. And I honestly think at the end of the day, it came down to, I actually really like some things about Trump. And I actually really care about his immigration policies or economic stuff, but I'm going to pretend it's abortion. And so when you tell me, hey, he won't actually lower abortions because it's really these state laws and these other things, I'm going to come back with this other, I just care about this laws changing, because I'm stuck with, once abortion becomes the primary thing and everything else, you know, is secondary to that, I have to find some way to justify what I already wanted to do with abortion. And so I find a way to you know, move things around.
And the data verifies exactly that. It wasn't the top issue for most Christian voters. So you're absolutely right.
Okay. I want to talk about individualism a little bit, because a lot of this, you know, and maybe Gregory Thompson disagrees, I'm not sure, but a lot of this boils down to why are we so individualistic, and why because countries have been ranked on a scale of individualistic versus collectivistic, you know, on one end of the extreme or the other end of the extreme. The most collectivistic countries tend to be Asian countries. The most individualistic country on earth is ours, United States of America. One person described it as, you know, if you live in an individualistic country, you consider individuals like particles in a gas that are free to move anywhere, do anything, have no constraint around them. If you're in a collectivistic society, you think of yourself as a particle in a crystal, that you're part of a structure and your place in the structure is important and fairly rigid. And then there's a whole spectrum in between. But this was something that I thought was interesting. This was a Freakonomics Radio did a couple of episodes just talking about, you know, what makes America unique in the world. and why you can't necessarily just say, hey, this policy worked here, so maybe it'll work in America. Hey, let's try this thing that Sweden tried, or let's try this thing, that Hungary is trying, and it'll work in America. One of the things that they brought up I thought was really interesting, and I see this in my conversations on my Facebook page, countries with very high individualism. Okay, high individualism leads to the justification of inequality. So there's a link between high individualism and comfort with inequality because we put it on the individual. If you're at the bottom of the ladder, it's because of the choices you've made or that your parents made. And if you make different choices, and I hear this so often, the people that aren't doing well could be doing well if they made better choices. There's nothing systemic that keeps people down. It's our own choices. And this is America. And in America, you can go as far as you want to go. So if we want to believe that, if we want to believe that in my country, no one can hold you back, you can go as far as you want to go, that's a form of argument for being comfortable with inequality. And you see that Washington Post just did a piece on the current stats on wealth inequality in America. The combined wealth of all households in the United States adds up to $129 trillion. The wealthiest 1% of Americans held 1/3 of that total. So 1% of Americans hold 1/3 of America's total wealth, which is up from 1/4 in 1989. The top 10% of households in America own 70% of America's wealth. The bottom 50% of households in America who have never in history owned more than 5% of America's wealth now hold just 2% of America's wealth. So half of America holds 2% of America's wealth. 1% of America holds 33% of America's wealth. So, and we are a complete outlier among industrialized nations. So it is typical that, there's a whole lot more wealth at the top of the scale than at the bottom of the scale. But they looked at, in 2018, they looked at 28 countries that are all industrialized, advanced democracies. And the average is the top 10% of households owns about half of the wealth. The bottom 60% owns about 12%. But in the United States, the top 10% holds 80% and the bottom 60% holds 2.5%. So we are an outlier even among all other, industrialized nations. And the other thing that they bring up that we're really an outlier on is that we're highly individualistic and we're also highly religious. And you don't see that very often. So I want to back up and look at those two things together and say, if you're going to be the most individualistic country on earth with the largest wealth disparity, wealth inequality of any industrialized country on earth, and you're also highly religious, there's a pretty good chance that you've worked out your theology to make room for inequality. And that's kind of what I wanted to just discuss just a little bit is like, how do we see ourselves adapting our theology to fit the American uniqueness of wanting to be very religious and not very sensitive to inequality? Caitlin?
The first thing that comes to my mind is like, when a lot of the churches that I've grown up in and continue to be in make a big deal, right, about taking the Bible literally. And they don't always use that, helpfully. Like sometimes we just kind of blanket, like literally, we take the Bible literally. But if you were to hear a sermon in most of those churches on a passage about sexual ethics, or a very highly contextual passage about women, like what women can do or preach or teach, it's going to be the words on the page are the words that they are. And if it says you do this, we don't take any kind of historical context into account. We don't think about progressive revelation. The words are there. The words that my immediate understanding of them without any other context, that's the meaning. But if I was to take a passage from James about, woe to the wealthy, for you have exploited your workers, that just the words on the page say, all the wealthy have exploited their work. I mean, there's no real kind of excuse there for anyone. It just says that's what you have done. You've exploited your workers. you are going to, not have the things that are actually most valuable in life and die that way. There's like really intense. If I was to hear a sermon on that in most of those churches, it would be like, okay, hold up. We have to look at the context. We have to be very careful. It doesn't apply to everyone. Wealth can be very good. So we have, even just in the way that we preach actual passages on those things. There's other cultural forces, but even in just the actual taught theology in a lot of churches, it is very firm and clear on things like sexual ethics and on women's roles and things like that. But when it comes to passages about wealth, and there are an incredible amount of passages about wealth, we either don't talk about them.
Yeah, how many different ways have you heard the camel through the eye of a needle verse unpacked?
Explained away is what we're doing. It's like that's really the goal, is to just make it seem like that's not a big deal.
But then you get to, as it Paul's statement, to one of the churches, that he who does not work shall not eat. And how many times have you heard that very clearly applied to welfare policy? Well, you can't.
Right.
If you're not working, you don't eat. That's the Bible's as clear as day.
And never applied to really wealthy people who don't have to work anymore because their wealth is just building itself and they're not actually contributing anything.
Well, that raises an important point. If you are a super rich person in America, it makes sense for you to emphasize individual responsibility, because that framework gives you total ownership and affirmation for being rich. But the flip side is also true. If you are an incredibly poor person in America, it's far more appealing to have a communalism as your primary vision, where you can blame everyone but yourself for being poor. And both of those extremes, I would argue, are unbiblical. There is always a degree of personal responsibility and always a component of communal dynamics for whether you're rich or you're poor. And this attitude that we have to pick one or the other is ridiculous. So an honest reading of Scripture,
right.
I think,
even the economists that talk about the difference between a highly individualistic versus a highly collectivistic society, completely secular economists say neither one of these is right.
Yeah.
There are pros and cons to either of these. The problem becomes more if you're in a collectivistic society and you lock individuals into that crystalline structure so much it's impossible to move, you greatly reduce innovation. You greatly reduce economic vitality. And on the other hand, if you're so individualistic that you think every individual can do whatever they want and pursue your dreams and make anything happen, you completely ignore people at the bottom of the rung because you blame them. So it's not we're doing it right or we're doing it wrong. It's that you need to balance these two views of humanity.
Let me give you one of my favorite examples from Scripture of how we see what we want to see rather than what's actually there. There was an experiment done years ago where they took the story of the prodigal son, and they had different people from different cultural backgrounds read the story, and then they were told to close their Bible and tell the story back. And they recorded what details did people remember and which ones did they overlook. And what they found is that in very wealthy, highly individualistic cultures like the American culture, everyone remembered that the younger son went off to a distant country and squandered all of his wealth on wild living, right? It's about personal responsibility. And the reason he ended up in those terrible circumstances of feeding pods to the pigs is because he was irresponsible with his wealth. All the emphasis is on personal responsibility. In poorer countries, they also remember a detail that almost every wealthy American forgot, and that is that there was a famine in the land where the son had gone off to. In other words, his circumstances weren't just the result of his bad decisions, they were also the result of things beyond his control. So the famine means there's an economic depression, there's no harvesting, there's no growth in the country, so he had no economic opportunity, even if he were responsible. So it's a combination of the two, but we only focus on the things that fit our cultural biases, or as John Walton would say, our cultural river. And we have to learn to see what's actually there rather than just what we want to see there.
Right. I hear you. Speaking of things beyond our control, a new study came out in Chicago looking at the gap in life expectancy between Black and non-Black residents in Chicago, which is now up to almost a decade. So
Wow.
the average life expectancy for a black Chicagoan is 71 years. For a white or a non-black Chicagoan is 80 years, almost 81 years. And when they boil it down to neighborhood levels, like between West Garfield Park, that neighborhood of Chicago, which is majority black, and Edison Park, which is a majority white neighborhood, there's a 14 and a half year average lifespan gap just between those two
Wow.
neighborhoods within Chicago. And as they unpack these things, you start to get into the biggest issue. I mean, it's not violence. It's in the top 5, but it's not in the top 3. Biggest issue is chronic health outcomes, and historically across America, we pushed African Americans to live in the worst places, which tended to be the closest to the industries that do the most polluting. So if there was a big smelly factory, chances are the neighborhood right next to it was black. And those are the kids that are growing up, breathing polluted air their entire lives. And guess what? They hit 50 and they've got asthma. And they can't get healthy food because they live in food deserts. So these things just stack up. One interesting thing that they brought up on the Freakonomics episode was that black folks, this was a black scholar they were interviewing, said black folks have rarely had the luxury of thinking only about themselves, of thinking completely individualistically. So the black community tends to be more collectivistic. The theology then, we extrapolate off that, the theology tends to be more collectivistic, which is why white suburban evangelicals tend to look at black theology with suspicion, as it's kind of Marxist, it's kind of communist. There's something wrong there. People with an individualistic mindset were more likely to immigrate to America from Europe. It was something we actually self-selected for individualism. If you're going to leave your family, leave your tribe, leave everything because you want to better yourself, you're already self-selecting for individualism. That was not true of African slaves that were brought from Africa. There was no, who wants to make a name for themselves in the New World? It was no, like, you get on the ship and you're coming over. So you can see some of this tension between white Christian America and black Christian America, in that we all believe, white suburban Christians, believe that Christianity is an individual salvation motivated Protestant work ethic, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, God helps those who help themselves religion. And then we bump into our black brothers and sisters who have a more collectivistic, no, we're all looking out for each other, and we really need to talk about the political implications of the gospel, and we need to raise ourselves up as a community. And we find that theology wanting because it doesn't fit in with the self-selected group that ended up here from Europe. That's my piece.
Okay.
I'm done. Good night. Good night, everyone. Jason, sing us out.
You really don't want that.
Before we have Jason sing, I got two things.
Yes.
Number one, what you're saying, Phil, is something that I have said repeatedly on this show over the years, which is I've always been convinced that our theology, we allow our economics to define our theology. And people don't want to believe that, but I think all the evidence is there. But the other question I have is, I'm very curious to know, how does that hypothesis that you put forward work with more recent immigrant groups like Hispanic immigrants and Asian immigrants? So, like, my father's from South Asia. He immigrated here, a much more collectivist society, although my dad, I think, is a very hyper individualist, which explains partly why he left his family and was able to immigrate to America.
Why he wanted to come.
Right. So that's why I'm curious, as Asian immigrants, South Asian or East Asian immigrants who come from more collectivist cultures, nonetheless, are immigrants to America. Are they more individualistic in their theology, or do they retain a communal theology in this? And same thing with Hispanic immigrants. So I would be curious to see how this is going to play out with those other groups, when you have sort of extreme examples in Northern white Europeans immigrating and African slaves being forcibly brought to the Americas. It's so what about everyone in between?
There are people on the right that make the argument against helping African Americans that they shouldn't need help because look, and then they use the comparison, African immigrants of the last 30, 40 years.
Yeah.
So people who immigrated from Africa, they're doing fine. They're doing way better than native-born African Americans. So clearly there's nothing wrong with the system. It's just a personal motivation. And what they fail to take into consideration is that people who immigrate to America are self-selecting as usually the most educated, the most ambitious, and the most individualistic people from those countries. That's why they want to come. They don't, if you're poor and you will not leave your family or your tribe, you're not coming to America. So you end up attracting the people from around the world that are the most American, and they do very well. Because they're not born in the south side of Chicago where they're going to grow up with all these health risks and food risks and educational risks. So, we try to use the success of immigrants to kind of insult native-born African Americans or Latinos that aren't doing well. Like, why aren't you doing well? Again, completely ignoring the systemic issues that affect, the number one, if you want to know how a kid is going to turn out in America, there is one number that can tell you more accurately than any other number how a kid will turn out in America, what their life will be like. And it's not their IQ, it's the zip code in which they were born. Where you are born is the most accurate predictor of how your whole life will turn out in America. And if we don't care about that, because it was your fault for being born in that zip code. And Ben Carson was born in a bad zip code, and he turned out okay.
Isn't that statistic, though, a direct assault on the American myth?
It should be, but
the American myth is that
anybody,
anybody can become anything. But if you're telling me it's determined by the place of your birth, that's exactly what we wanted to get away from in Europe, was the aristocracy that said the class you were born into determined everything about your life.
We have not gotten away from it. And we need to be aware how much our theology is impacted by our economics, but even by the zip code of our birth. My theology is affected by the zip code I was born in. I have to face that reality and be open to those conversations with people that were born in very different zip codes with very different outcomes and are still followers of Jesus. So anyway, Caitlin, you got any last words before we wrap it up?
Well, my other thought about why a lot of immigrants would kind of really, not only be self-selecting to be more individualistic, but become more individualistic, hearing kind of, being immersed in the story America tells itself. But also there's always a risk when you are changing the way that you grew up of overcorrecting. And so if you're coming from a really collectivist group and you're attracted to what America is doing, you're not probably just going to kind of end up in the middle ground between collectivist and individualistic. You're probably going to go really far the other direction to like overcorrect what you maybe saw some excesses of collectivism in your own context. And that's probably true for a lot of like younger evangelicals who are reacting against the hyper individualism. Is like, it's really hard to find that middle ground without just so completely overcorrecting that you disregard any of the good things about the way that you grew up. Like if you plop yourself in a really truly hyper collectivist society, you would notice after a while like the things you might appreciate about the way you grew up. But being able to not do the overcorrecting thing is really hard. And my guess would be that that's also true of some immigrants in the US, of like coming from one place and kind of going really far the other direction. And then America encouraging it, because that fits. If you can succeed at that, we're going to pump up your story. Like if you're able to do the American dream, we're going to tell your story and then use it to kind of instill that individualism even in people in poorer communities, because they want to believe that too, of not only do richer people want to believe that to say, I've earned everything I've gotten, but if you're in a not good financial situation, you want to believe that the system is set up in such a way that if you work hard enough, you'll succeed.
Right. Skye, was that Steve calling you to say he's ready to beat you up now?
He's challenging me. No, it was my daughter who I silenced.
Don't say it like that.
Okay.
Like a good patriarch.
No.
You're gonna hear about that on the internet.
Hey, and also it was Splinter, not Shredder. Splinter.
Right. Shredder was a bad guy.
Yeah.
Splinter,
Yeah.
Shredder, the bad guy. See, if you shred,
forgive
you're
me.
a bad guy. If you splinter things, you're a good guy. It's obvious. It's right there in black and white. Okay. We have an interview. We have a guest, Skye.
Yeah.
Okay. And it's awesome. It's going to be
It's
great.
good. Yeah, it's absolutely amazing.
Okay. All right. Thanks for stopping by, y'all. Thanks for your support on Patreon. Really appreciate it. And we will see you next week.
When Phil and I started this show back in 2012, we had no idea it would find an audience or become so helpful to so many people, but it has. And we're incredibly grateful to be on a journey with all of you as we learn and laugh and grow into faithful Christians who love one another and our neighbors in this incredibly diverse society. We have a lot of plans to expand the Holy Post in the months and years ahead, and you've gotten just a small glimpse of some things we're up to, like the Jesus and John Wayne miniseries we did with historian Kristen Kobes-Dumais, and there's plenty more to come. But our ability to do those projects and reach even more people who need to hear the Holy Post really depends on your support. By becoming a Holy Post patron, you can contribute to the growth of this show, and for your support, you get access to bonus interviews with our guests, exclusive Holy Post merchandise like artwork and t-shirts, behind-the-scenes content, and even participate in a monthly live stream with me, Phil, and Christian. To find out more about how to become a patron, go to holypost.com and click on the Support Us link at the top of the page. Thank you so much for taking this journey with us, and stay tuned because there's a lot more great stuff coming soon from the Holy Post. My guest today is no stranger to the show. Kara Powell is my friend and my go-to expert on everything related to teenagers and young adults in the faith. She's been researching them for years, and she's written a bunch of helpful books for church leaders and parents on the challenges of engaging teenagers with God's love in today's culture. Her latest book, co-authored with Brad Griffin, is 3 big questions that change every teenager, making the most of your conversations and connections. Again, it's all based on their research and data, and as you'll hear from our interview, there's a lot of wisdom here not just for engaging teens, but frankly everyone, as our society faces an epidemic of loneliness. Dr. Kara Powell is the Chief of Leadership Formation and the Executive Director of the Fuller Youth Institute at Fuller Theological Seminary, and some of her previous books include Sticky Faith, Faith in an Anxious World, and Growing With, a title I'm particularly fond of. Here is my conversation with Kara Powell. Kara Powell, welcome back to the Holy Post.
Oh, it's great to be with you, Skye. I always love conversations with you.
Likewise, and I always enjoy the books that you are producing. So for those who don't know, you have a long career in studying teenagers in the church and their faith.
Yeah.
You've written a whole bunch of books and done a ton of research on this. Can you briefly just recap the research you've done that led to this newest work and why you're asking the questions now that you're asking?
Yeah, so it probably in many ways, the first thing I should talk about was 10 years ago, we at the Fuller Youth Institute did some research on sticky faith in the midst of up to half of youth group graduates drifting from God and the church. We tried to figure out what churches and families could do to help young people have a faith that lasts, or like I said, sticky faith. And that certainly has impacted my own parenting, my own understanding of the gospel, the church. That was very game changing for me personally, as a parent, as a leader, and a follower of Jesus. Was that body of research. And then, as I was praying about what we should do next in the Full Youth Institute, I felt led, and our team felt led, to study amazing churches. With Sticky Faith, we studied amazing young people. We wanted to study amazing churches. In the midst of so many churches shrinking and aging, we looked over 250 churches that are growing young, is what we ended up calling them. And we identified the 6 qualities that these churches tended to have that help them love and serve young people. And in the midst of that research project on growing young, we saw the importance of churches empathizing with young people. You know, millennials and Gen Z often feel like the church is pointing a finger at them and judging them. And one of the 6 qualities we saw is that churches that empathize and don't judge, but journey with young people, are more effective with young people. And so really, this next book, the book that just came out, 3 Big Questions That Change Every Teenager, is our deep dive into the pressing questions that we as adults need to understand, that young people are wrestling with them, so that we can truly journey with them and empathize with them.
Okay, which brings me to the whole topic of empathy. Define what you mean by empathy, and what are the qualities of an empathetic church, not just as it relates to teenagers and young people, but in general. What do you look
Yeah.
for?
Well, in Growing Young, we defined empathy as sitting on the curb of a young person's life, which is actually phrasing that my friend Chap Clark first coined. And I love that image that we as adults, I should say those of us over 30, we're taking the time to stop, sit, pay attention to what's going on in a young person's life and journey. We realized in this book, Three Big Questions That Change Every Teenager, that we needed more specifics. And so we defined empathy as noticing and caring. So being mindful of what was happening in a young person's life, their attitudes, their actions, their feelings, their thoughts, etc., their heart cries, and then showing that we care, knowing how to ask the next question, knowing what to say and what not to say. You know, we as adults, we're so well intentioned, but when we say things like, when I was your age, that sounds patronizing in the ears of a teenager or a young adult. It sounds like we're trying to assume too much about them and their similarity to us. And so that's part of what empathizing is realizing that there are well-intentioned things that we tend to do and say that actually create walls instead of bridges with young people.
Okay, before we dive into those three questions, the three
Yeah.
big questions that form the title of your book, um, going backwards, you talk about churches that empathize with teenagers, that sit on the curb with them, that notice them, that talk to them, that engage deeply with them. I imagine there are probably some church leaders listening to this right now or watching our video on YouTube who are saying, yeah, of course we do that. We hired a youth pastor to do that.
Right.
Uh, what what are you advocating for beyond just assigning somebody to pay attention to teenagers that creates a church culture in which uh, teens can actually thrive?
Yeah. So I'm all for hiring youth pastors. I think that's often an important step for a church to take, or designating somebody to be the head of youth ministry, whether or not a salary is involved. One of my life mantras is that balance is something we swing through on our way to the other extreme. And so, in our effort to provide age related ministry with young people, we have created kind of this industry of youth ministry, which on the one hand is really beautiful, but on the other hand, it pulls young people out of the congregation and gets them in their own youth rooms with their own small group leaders, with their own worship, etc. And so, this chasm has grown between those over 30 and those under 30. And so it's pretty impossible to empathize with someone if you're never interacting with them, right? And so a theme in all 10 years of our research, Skye, has been how important it is to have intergenerational relationships. That when we segregate the age groups, well, first off, it's bad for the young people. But here's been the consistent twist in our research: is it's not only bad for the young people, it's bad for those of us over 30 too. That we miss out on the innovation, the creativity, the vitality that young people add. So most of our research projects have started out looking at how churches and ministries change young people. And then along the way, we see how young people are changing churches. So yeah, we need to figure out how to creatively engage across these generational gaps.
Okay, I mean, this is conversations that go back 10 years for you and I when you did
Yeah,
Sticky Faith, and you
yeah,
talked about the kids' table problem in many
yes.
churches, like,
Good
Thanksgiving,
memory,
where,
Skye. Yeah,
well, I mean, I have teenagers. These things are relevant to me for sure. But I want to go back because I think it's important that that pendulum swing is relevant here.
yeah,
I have talked to youth pastors who feel like youth ministry has been too segregated and siloed in the church, and they advocate for a complete and full integration of
yeah,
teenagers into everything, and breaking down essentially the construct of youth ministry that we've developed over the last 30 or 50 years. But your own research is showing that it is helpful to have sometimes age specific ministries and activities and communities for these teenagers. So it's not one or the other.
yeah.
if I'm hearing you correctly.
Yeah, and that's actually a way that I think our research has sometimes been misinterpreted, is that we're calling for the abolition of youth ministry. And
Yeah.
that's not at all the case. I mean, I think, I want my 15-year-old and my 18-year-old and my 20-year-old to be in discussions about those life stage issues. I think there's something important about that, where they're with their peers. As one youth leader told me, the average 18-year-old doesn't want to talk about pornography with grandma in the room. And grandma doesn't want to be in the room, and I don't want to be the adult leading that discussion.
Right.
So, so we need places that we can talk about those particularly
Right.
poignant issues. It's just that, and so this is, I think, a question for every church and ministry to ask itself: where are we on the continuum? Have we overemphasized, age segregation? Or have we swung so far that maybe we're missing out on some of those developmental issues, and we need to provide some forums for specific discussions about that?
Okay, let's jump into the three big questions, because I first read your book months ago, but long before it was published, because I was grateful to get an advance copy of it.
And you endorsed it. Thank you very much for that, Skye.
Happily, enthusiastically endorsed it. Here's my beef, though. And it's not really
Bring
a beef.
it on. Bring it on.
It's not a beef. To get to it, the three big questions are: who am I, which is about identity;
Yeah.
where do I fit, which is about belonging; and what difference can I make, which is about purpose.
Right.
It's hard to disagree with you that those are incredibly relevant questions for a teenager. As I read this book, though, I'm going, these are relevant to everybody. This is not limited to teenagers. I know 15, 60-year-olds that are still struggling with these three questions.
Yeah.
So before we dive into the specifics of what it means to be a teenager, in 2021 who's wrestling with these questions, did you encounter any adults in your life who are like, yeah, we need to talk about this throughout the entire church, not just with teenagers? And what does that look like?
Yeah, well, the first adult I encountered was myself in the mirror, because you're absolutely right, Skye, that identity, belonging, and purpose, these three questions, they're not just young people questions, they're people questions.
Right.
They're questions, I think they're human questions that, I don't want to make huge transcultural statements, but that a lot of generations and a lot of cultures wrestle with.
Right.
And so I would say, for those of us over 30, they're more at a low simmer. So they're still alive and active every day. And I can talk further about how I wrestle with each of these questions myself, for sure. So they're alive and active every day, but it's a low simmer. For those under 30, that teenager, that college student, that young adult, they're more at a rolling boil. So I actually agree with you. And we tried to say this in the book. We probably could have said it more strongly and clearly, that all of us wrestle with these issues. And in fact, the way that we empathize with young people is increased if we're aware of our own wrestling with these issues. And so, being aware of how we're growing and being challenged in identity, belonging, and purpose helps us in our own journey, and also helps us as we relate to young people.
This summer, I did a road trip from California back to Chicago with my 16-year-old son, and obviously had great conversations, just the two of us. But he brought up a number of times that he's stressed out because he doesn't know what he's supposed to do with his life.
Yeah.
Right. He's 16.
Yeah.
And we dove into some specifics, and he's like, I don't know what I'm going to be doing in 5 years. And finally I had to say to him, Isaac, I don't know what I'm going to be doing in 5 years.
Exactly.
Right? I mean, I didn't want to dismiss his concern, but I also wanted him to realize that it's okay not to have concrete, clear answers to all of these really big questions at such a young age. And many of us are still wrestling with a lot of these things. Okay, let's begin with identity.
Yeah.
As you said, many people in many cultures, many generations wrestle with these questions, but they're at a boil for a lot of teenagers today. But I also want to talk about how that boil may be unique to this generation right now. What is adding to confusion around identity for young people today that those of us over 30 may not have experienced when we were their age?
Yeah. So one of the questions that we also wrestled with during the course of our research for this book, and Skye, maybe I can describe the research a bit. We surveyed over 2,000 teenagers, and then we did deep dives with 27 teenagers around the country. We spent 4 to 6 hours interviewing each of those 27 teenagers. Census data shows that in the midst of everything else that happened in 2020, we also crossed an important line for those under 18, where half of those under 18 are people who are white and half of those are people of color. And so we actually skewed our sample to be much more leaning toward people of color. So 7 of the 20 teenagers were kids who were white, and the other were from a variety of ethnicities and cultures, and sometimes bicultural kids too. So it was a really, really rich sample. And we asked that question, like, how is this generation unique? And we landed on 3 adjectives. This generation is an anxious generation. We can't talk about young people without looking at their struggles with mental health, which have only, doubled, tripled, sometimes quadrupled during the pandemic. And as I'm spending time with youth leaders and parents and therapists, Skye, about every 3 days, one of them will say to me, "I don't think we understand yet how the pandemic has truly affected young people's mental health. We still don't really know it all." So this is an anxious generation. This is an adaptive generation. Like, this is a creative generation that wants to be involved in meaningful work. They're resilient. Whether it's because they've had great adult support or they've lacked great adult support, they have generated the grit that Angela Duckworth writes about in her research. And then the third adjective is that this is a diverse generation. And so let me camp on that when it comes to identity. I already mentioned ethnic and racial diversity. Young people are having different questions about gender identity than those of us who are older often did. And so, when we spent time with these 27 teenagers, we really tried to listen to how they're defining themselves. And the 2 big ways that they're currently defining their identity. Number 1, they're defining their identity by others' expectations. And again, those are diverse expectations. So a teenager's navigating what family wants, and there might be nuclear family and extended family, could be both levels, what the church wants, what school wants, what sports wants. For kids of color, they're also navigating kind of this clash they feel between what maybe their indigenous culture invites them to be part of and what white dominant culture expects. So there's all these different scripts, basically, that young people are trying to live up to for their identity, which I think leads to the second common answer we heard with identity, and that is they don't feel like they're enough. They don't feel like they're smart enough, talented enough, popular enough, attracted enough. For kids of color, they often don't feel like they're Latino enough, Black enough, because again, they're navigating multiple worlds and that intersectionality. And so I think the diversity of worlds that young people come from and experience is a new layer of complexity for this generation when it comes to identity.
So that makes me think that the part of what's contributing to the anxiety is the diversity. I mean, I knew that as a teenager coming from a biracial, multicultural kind of background, it does increase your questions around identity for sure. For the most part, I consider diversity an asset, right? It's a strength, it's a blessing, but it does create anxiety because there's no single norm to which you measure yourself against. There's now many. What role did you find, or did you hear from in these interviews, technology is playing, or social media? I mean, a lot of times that becomes the boogeyman.
Yeah.
Whenever we talk about mental health challenges for this generation, it's always the smartphones, it's social media. I've talked to therapists and psychiatrists who do attribute some culpability to that, but I'm hesitant to say that alone explains it, even though it'd be an easy answer. So what did you find in your research?
Yeah. Well, I'm very pro technology. Technology is what is letting you and I talk today, here from Pasadena, California, and I assume you're in Chicago. I didn't ask.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and it's allowing us to, have this conversation with your viewers and your listeners. So I'm very pro technology. It is interesting how technology can both help and hurt a young person's quest for identity, belonging, and purpose. And I'll go quickly through each one. So identity, social media gives young people a chance to experiment with different parts of who they are. And there's something beautifully developmental about that. The problem is young people then spend a lot of energy trying to figure out what brand, and we have 12 and 13-year-olds talking about their brand, what brand they want to curate, and so technology, social media, it both helps a young person explore their identity, but it can cause them to foreclose or adopt false identities. It's even more complicated, I think, when it comes to belonging, that second question. There's data from the pandemic about how technology and social media was like a lifeline for teenagers in the last year and a half, and it's something really beautiful. But there's obviously a downside to it. When I was not invited to a Friday night party, I maybe heard about it on Monday morning, whereas teenagers today see it unfolding in real time in the device in their hand. So I think there's a lot more of a sense of what you're not part of, how you don't belong. It can both help belonging, but it can also make you feel like you don't belong when you're seeing others do fun, great things without you. And then purpose, that third question. I mean, I love how social media is making young people more aware of the needs of the world, more aware of how they can be advocates. I had a funny thing happen on 4th of July. I came out for church. It was kind of our church's like welcome back worship service. And so I was wearing this new dress that I had bought during the pandemic that was orange. And my 15-year-old said, "Nice orange dress, Mom." And she had it with a little bit of a tone of voice. And so I thought she was referring to, it's a brighter color than I tend to wear. And so I said, "Yeah, I know, Jessica, this is a lot of orange." And she could tell I wasn't tracking. So she said, no. If you wear orange today on 4th of July, you're protesting for more equality for Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And so you're actually, affirming more equality and racial justice. And I was like, great. I kind of protested on accident today. And it was my 15-year-old who let me know, and I love talking with my kids about what they see on social related to race and justice in particular. But I think social media can also be a placebo where young people feel like, I hashtag justice, or I take a picture of myself in an orange shirt on 4th of July and I'm doing something substantive. And often that's falling short of what the kingdom work would be that we could be involved in. So I see technology as something that's a beautiful asset, but also can sabotage some of young people's quest for identity, belonging, and purpose.
So what advice would you give to either parents or church leaders when it comes to the appropriate or harmful use of those technologies in the formation of their young people?
You got to know your kid. I mean, I think there are some important rules of thumb that we at the Full Youth Institute offer, that a lot of other organizations offer, about protecting dinners, having car time, those sorts of things, not sleeping with devices and all that, taking devices before teenagers go into their rooms at night. All of that is really important. So those are some helpful rules of thumb. But I think you need to understand your own teenager, young adult, your neighbor, that congregant, that kid or stepkid in your home, and how is technology helping them, and when is it hurting them, and then have a conversation about that with them, and see what ideas might emerge from that conversation.
Okay, to the belonging idea. This again goes back to stuff and research that you've been talking about for a decade now. What are you seeing in churches that are really effective at making young people feel as if they belong to that community? What are some practical steps we can take so they don't just feel like an appendage, but really are integrated?
Well, I'll tell a story of actually a Chicago church, Skye, that's in one of our cohorts looking at these three questions right now. And in fall of 2020, they realized that the pandemic had taken a toll on their kids and on their youth ministry. And this is a fairly large church. The youth ministry had been 200 teenagers. And by the end of the summer, it was down to 100 teenagers joining on Zoom. So a fair amount of attrition, but that's not unusual for what a lot of youth ministries were seeing with Zoom Youth Group. It's pretty typical, actually. And so this church did a couple things that were really important. First, they listened to their teenagers. They wanted to know, what is it that our young people are wrestling with? And so they did a lot of interviews. They did a lot of Zoom discussions trying to understand, what are our kids' losses and longings? And they came to realize that belonging was really what our kids were hungry for. And so first off, they listened and they empathized, which we've already talked about here today. But then secondly, they made strategic steps to actually meet those needs. And what they came to realize was kids were just not feeling connected to the youth ministry. And they had small groups, but as the youth pastor said, we put like 5% of our energy into small groups. So it was really more of an afterthought than the heart of the youth ministry. And they changed that last fall of 2020. And they recruited a bunch of small group leaders, trained those small group leaders, encouraged students to be in small groups, made that a real push. And they ended up, this ministry that had gone from 200 students to 100 students, ended up having 400 students now that are involved in small groups. But I think what's important is this church didn't just say, okay, we know y'all need to belong. Now here are some small groups. They really listened to their young people first to try to figure out what's the most pressing need, turned out to be belonging, and how could they meet it, turned out to be small groups. So I think belonging actually is a great place to start for a church because it is such a pressing need for teenagers. In fact, some of my psych colleagues here at Fuller, psychology faculty colleagues, they would say that belonging is kind of the first among equals of the three questions, that often belonging has inordinate influence on identity and purpose of the three. So it's a great open door with teenagers.
Okay, so when I think about these two topics we've just covered, which is the technology stuff and this belonging thing, it feels like there's a bit of a paradox going on for this generation. Because on one front, through technology, as you mentioned, they have infinite opportunity to experiment with their identity.
Yeah. They
have limitless number of pseudo communities they can be a part of online, and they can be an activist. For as simple as a hashtag activist on Twitter or, whatever, they can have some sense of purpose online. And yet, despite having that immense power in those tools today, their anxiety over these three questions is probably higher than any previous generation. Mm-hmm. So it says to me that they're longing for these things and they're looking for them to be fulfilled in a digital online capacity, but it just doesn't do it, which in my view would make what the church or a healthy church has to offer all that much more relevant and important. So when you do have a community of belonging, a small group perhaps, where that teenager feels heard and respected and can journey, I mean, that's an incredibly formative and powerful thing, more so than it used to be perhaps, just because of all the noise they're engaging.
Yeah.
What are some mistakes that you advise churches and church leaders to avoid, particularly with this generation, given the challenges they're facing?
About belonging or about anything?
You pick. Belonging perhaps, but any of them. Like, what are the most common mistakes you see that churches are making that in this generation are particularly harmful?
Yeah. I'll answer that in just a sec. I will say one comment that we heard from a young person who we were interviewing that relates to what you're saying about how there's a lot that technology offers, but still there's something missing. Is this young person said, you can download good sermons, but you can't download good mentoring. And so I think it is that
wonderful statement.
Totally. I think it is that mentoring as well as enhanced peer relationships that the church does have a unique asset to offer our world. In terms of mistakes, what comes to mind is a friend of mine who leads a national organization was spending time with a teenager, and he said this: I wish the church would stop answering questions that I'm not asking. And so I think the first mistake that we make in the church is we have all these assumptions about what young people are wondering based on who we were as young people and our experiences, based on a glimpse we'll get from the media, from the news, from social media that's only a headline and lacks that thick description. And so I think the first mistake that churches make is that we have assumptions about what young people are asking, which is actually where identity, belonging, and purpose has been so helpful for me is, as a parent even, is when my kid is doing something that doesn't quite make sense, when I stop and say, what are they hungering for? Identity, belonging, or purpose? 9 out of 10 times, like the penny drops for me at that point. And I realize, she's acting this way because she's hungry for belonging with her friends, or she's treating us this way because she's wrestling with this part of her identity. So I think first mistake, we're not listening enough, and then we're not thinking about the question behind the question, which often is identity, belonging, and purpose. I think the second thing that I would say on this theme of questions is we're not making space for young people's questions. And, Skye, you and I have talked about this before, that giving young people the chance to explore their doubts is amazingly healing and is actually an important part of discipleship. And a lot of times in children's ministry, it starts in children's ministry, that there's not this openness to tough questions. And so many of the teenagers we've interviewed, they say that, in third grade, it's often right around third grade, they come into Sunday school and they ask a tough question, like, why would God allow a certain tragedy? Or why are my parents going through the troubles they're going through? Whatever it might be for that third grader. And that well-intentioned third grade teacher kind of shushes them and says, sometimes verbally, sometimes more implicitly, we don't ask questions like that about God here. And that third grader then learns not only that the church can't handle their tough questions, but that God can't handle their tough questions. And then that becomes a lesson that sadly gets reinforced and stays with them through high school and beyond. And so, what I want adults to do is be a safe place for young people to ask any question about God, about life, about politics, about sexuality, whatever it might be, and that we're always a greenhouse where those questions can grow and flourish.
Okay, that brings up a really important point that I think if people are interested in your book, I don't want them to misunderstand. When you title the book Three Big Questions That Changes Every Teenager, but the assumption might be you're going to outline these three questions in the book and give the three answers that you then put in front of the teenager, and that's that. Which is not what you're doing here at all. It's these are the questions, the three big questions teenagers are asking, but then the book is really about how do you journey alongside them rather than just feel. So just recently we had on Beth DeMuth to talk about sexual abuse in the church. And one of the things she shared, which surprised me when I was asking her about prevention, she said one of the things they found is that when young people are raised in a highly authoritarian environment, their home or their church, where they're not allowed to ask questions, where they're not allowed to doubt, where everything is prepackaged and spoon-fed to them, that when they become young adults, they're more likely to get caught up in cults because they just don't know how to think for themselves. They don't know how to wrestle with things for themselves. And another charismatic authoritarian leader steps into their life and they just submit. And so what you're advising is it's just part of maturing, that we can't just spoon feed our young people all the right answers, but we need to allow them to wrestle with it a little bit. But that's hard for some of us. I mean, the question, who am I bet a lot of people listening to this are going, oh, I can answer that. I can tell a teenager who they are from a biblical point of view, a theological point of view, or whatever. But there's so many more layers even to that single question than just, well, here's the Bible verse that tells you who you are.
Yeah. Well, and that's where, I mean, maybe Skye, if we can talk for a few minutes about how do you ask a question that helps a young person bring up their questions?
Yeah, let's go there.
What questions help with that? I'll share three that I have found enormously helpful with teenagers and young adults, including my own kids. First is, if you could ask God any question, what would it be? I started asking our kids that question when they were, probably 8 or 9. And they had some really interesting ideas, even at that age, that they wanted to ask God about. So, and then of course it gets more and more abstract as they develop further. But if you could ask God any question, what would it be? And then two that I think are a great pairing. And I just did this a few weeks ago with our 15-year-old. The two questions are, what do you now believe that you think I don't believe? And then what do you no longer believe that you think I still believe? So what do you now believe that you think I don't believe? And what do you no longer believe that you think I still believe? And
so in other words, where do you think we disagree?
Where are we diverging? Yeah. And
right.
let's be okay talking about that. Like, that's what I love about those questions. They inherently say we're going to disagree, and that's okay. And they also nod to how our faith changes. And this is, It's interesting to me that, we adults, we want young people's faith to grow, but we don't want it to change, which doesn't make sense, right? If their faith is growing, then there's going to be elements of it that are going to change. And so, when I asked my 15-year-old these two questions a couple of weeks ago, we were in a 2-hour drive together, felt like a good time to ask the questions. And she talked about some more kind of cultural issues where she's more progressive than me. And we had a really good talk about what the Bible says or doesn't say about those issues. But it started because, at least at that moment on that car ride, she felt free to disagree with me. So,
yeah. Well, and whether it's explicit or implicit, what you're communicating there is that your love and commitment to her is not contingent upon her agreeing with you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which is just a great message for any kid to receive at any age. Okay, I got to pull my notes back up because of all of our tech glitches I had to navigate away. As we wrap up, give us another example of a congregational setting or a church setting, that a quality that is essential for them to shepherd teenagers through these questions without just smushing them. And can it be done? I mean, we've talked about small groups, we've talked about youth leaders, we've talked about parenting. Is there something on a broader scale that a church can do say in its worship gatherings or in its teaching and preaching, in its other environments, that creates that atmosphere where teenagers are respected, they're empathized with? Or does it always have to exist on that one-on-one or small group kind of level?
So when you ask that question, what comes to mind is something my good friend Kenda Creasy Dean at Princeton said once in a meeting that we were in together. She said, young people need to be viewed as load-bearing walls in the church. Now, I don't know a lot about construction, but I've done enough remodeling because Dave and I bought a fixer-upper that I know a load-bearing wall is like a big deal. And it's really important to the house, to the building being able to exist, let alone thrive. And I think that's a fabulous image that Kenda offers, is how can young people feel like they are such a part of the church that they are needed just as much as any other generation. And I'll tell you, what we've seen in our research is young people know when they're prioritized and when they're viewed as essential to the church. There was one church that we were studying in the upper Midwest where we were interviewing teenagers, and like the teenagers could point to the prayer meeting, the Sunday evening prayer meeting, where it's like something clicked in the senior pastor and he started prioritizing young people in a way that helped the overall congregation do so also. So that's what we want for young people, is that, as a church is looking ahead to a fall or to Christmas or Easter, they're thinking, one of the first 3 questions is, how do we connect with young people? How do we involve young people in this? Young people are often an afterthought at best. And we would love them to be one of the top 3 to 5 questions that churches are thinking about when they're thinking about the overall life of the church. Young people can tell where they are in that list of the church's important questions.
Well, in my experience, it seems like a lot of us who are in church ministry have been shaped, sometimes unconsciously, to think about people in 2 categories. There are the contributors and there are the takers, right? There are people who are volunteering, who are giving money, who are serving in the church infrastructure, who are advancing its mission, and then there are those who just come and show up and take resources and drain you. And we tend to organize everybody into one of those 2 buckets.
Mm-hmm.
And for the most part, all young people, not just teenagers, but kids, all fall into that second bucket. They are a drain on resources.
Yeah.
And it's going to take a significant shift in thinking to believe that they actually have something to contribute that is of value to the whole community. Obviously, Jesus believed they had value and significance. We see stories throughout both the Old and New Testaments of children actually contributing to the well-being of the community and to the mission of God. What is it that has to click for the church leader or pastor to see it differently? Is it an experience of receiving from a young person they hadn't expected? Like, what, other than just talking to them and saying, hey, you need to see young people as valuable as load-bearing walls, what is it going to take?
Well, often something does click in leaders when they become parents or grandparents of young people again, and they have a bigger burden for young people. When we interviewed churches and senior pastors that had prioritized young people, the word that they used to describe what young people most contributed was vitality. They use that time and time again. There's a vitality, there's a life, there's a passion, there's an innovation that not only draws young people, but that lifts the overall church. And one of our research questions in our Growing Young research was, when you prioritize young people, what then gets unprioritized, right? I mean, that was the way that I thought about it, kind of a zero-sum game. If you give a bigger piece of your budget and resource and energy pie to young people, then who gets a smaller piece? Is it women's ministry? Is it men's ministry? Is it senior adult ministry? Who suffers? And Skye, we asked that question of senior pastor after senior pastor. And again, these were churches that were doing amazing work with young people. So it was that kind of sample. But what the senior pastor said, in essence, is when we give young people a bigger piece of the pie, it's not that somebody else gets a smaller piece, it's that the whole pie grows. That there's something about young people and the lift they bring to the spirit of the congregation that raises everybody's boat. And so I think it's that realization that young people have a kind of a magnifying impact that can cut not just in youth ministry and young adult ministry, but can cut across the board. That seems to be the realization that pastors appreciated about young people.
Well, that's encouraging to me. I'm glad to hear that. I wonder if one of the concerns a church leader would have actually relates to the question that you were asking your teenager.
Yeah.
What do you believe that you don't think I believe anymore? And what are the differences? I wonder if one of the hesitations that churches have about empowering young people to be more load bearing in the community is a fear that these young people don't share our beliefs.
Yeah. Yeah.
That they may have ideas about things, maybe not even core theological ones, but peripheral things, cultural ideas that the older generation in our church doesn't agree with, and we don't want that brought to the surface.
Yeah.
So just keep them to the side, tell them to shut up, tell them to listen. We'll spoon feed them their answers. And when they look more like us and think more like us, then we can give them some platform and importance.
Yeah. And I'm not sure this generation is ever going to look like us or think like us.
Right.
So we're never, if that's our attitude, then we're never going to hand the keys over to young people. So how do we hand the keys over to young people in such a way that we co-create together the future of the church? So, my daughter, my 18-year-old, said something a few months ago. We were driving and we were talking about, she loves our church, but we were talking about something she didn't like about our church. And I said, well, when you go to college, then I hope you can help find and maybe even create a church that has that quality and that loves Jesus. And she said, I think I'm just going to have to wait until all the old people die off. and luckily we were at a light, because I think I would have pulled over the minivan right at that moment and said, no, Krista, you can't wait. We can't let you wait until the old people die off. And so, older people, we can't wait until young people look like us. They never will. They're going to follow Jesus in their own way. And young people, you can't wait until we're out of the picture. We need to co-create what it means to follow Jesus and be the church together. And that's what makes me optimistic, Skye, about the church and young people and our world, is we can see those generations come together.
Amen. And the principle you've just articulated there doesn't just apply to generational differences, but cultural, racial differences as well within the church. We need to be doing this together instead of just waiting for one group to look more like the other. Kara, thank you so much for your time and for this latest batch of research and super helpful tool that you've given to us as parents and church leaders. 3 big questions that change every teenager. I know we ran a little long today because of our tech glitches. Are you able to stick around for a few minutes for a brief bonus conversation?
Yeah, I absolutely can. And before we log off, I do want to say we're such fans of the holypost that we have a special option. If your listeners and viewers go to 3bigquestionsbook.com, That's 3, the number, bigquestionsbook.com/holypost. We've got not only a free chapter of the book, but we have 40 conversation starters that aren't in the book to help any adult better connect with teenagers. So that's a gift to Holy Post folks that we want to make sure that your listeners and viewers know about.
Well, that's awesome. That's fantastic that we get material. You get bonus material for just listening to the Holy Post.
You get something special. Absolutely.
Yeah. All right. Well, if you are a Holy Post Patreon supporter, you're going to get a bonus conversation with Kara right now. So you can head over there. If you're not a Patreon supporter, I don't know why. I mean, why would you ever pass up on this opportunity? So, Kara, what we're going to talk about is this purpose question a little bit more. That third question, because we didn't get as deep into there as I wanted to, and talk about how some of the sacred secular divide that exists in a lot of Christian communities can disrupt this journey toward purpose for young people and all of us. So stick around for that. Kara, thanks again for being here, and we'll see you again soon.
Thank you.
The Holy Post Podcast is a production of Phil Vischer Enterprises, that's Phil's company, and Skye Pilot Media, that's Skye's company. Production assistance by Julie Betcher. Editing by Jason Rugg. Help us create more thoughtful Christian media by supporting us at patreon.com/holypost. Also, be sure to leave a review on iTunes so more people can discover thoughtful Christian commentary plus ukulele and occasional butt news. Visit holypost.com for show notes, news stories, and more.